Hello, friends. It is opening night at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. The house is full, the lights are dimming, and the great crimson curtain waits to rise. But behind it, in the darkness where only the cast can tread, a woman has been strangled. She will never take her final bow. The killer did not flee into the London night. The killer is still here, smiling among the actors, the director, the crew, someone who smiled at her only hours ago, someone driven by envy that has festered for years. Hercule Poirot came tonight only to rest his tired eyes on a play. Instead, he must step into the shadows and find which member of the cast is wearing a mask far more dangerous than any on stage. The curtain has already fallen on one life. How many more will it claim before the truth is revealed? Now, let us pull it back. Curtain rises, London, spring 1955. The Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, stood like an old gentleman who still knew how to dress for the evening. Its columns were clean, its steps swept, and the great glass doors reflected the yellow glow of the street lamps. Inside, the air already carried the familiar mixture of dust, face powder, and the faint metallic smell of the stage lights warming up. Hercule Poirot sat in the third row of the stalls, his hands resting neatly on the program. He had not come to London for a case. He had come because his old friend, George Lorimer, the theatre's general manager, had written to him 3 weeks earlier. "Come and see the new play, Poirot. It will do you good. You have been working too hard. Besides, I should like your opinion. There is something about this production that makes me uneasy." Poirot had smiled at the letter. George had always been a worrier. Still, the invitation had come at the right time. Paris had been damp, and his flat in London had stood empty for too long. So he had accepted. The play was called The Bitter Glass, a new work by a young playwright named Simon Crowe. It was not the usual light entertainment the Lane was famous for. It was a sharp, uncomfortable piece about jealousy between two women who had once been friends. The critics had already begun to whisper that it might be unpleasant. The public, of course, would come anyway. Poirot adjusted his pince-nez and glanced at the program. The name at the top of the cast list was printed in bold letters. Eleanor Shaw as Caroline. He had seen her once before, years ago, in a smaller theatre. She had been very good, beautiful in a cold, striking way, with a voice that could cut glass when she wished it to. Success had come to her quickly after that. Some said too quickly. The house lights dimmed. The audience settled. The great crimson curtain, heavy and old, trembled slightly as the tabs were drawn back. The first act began. Poirot watched with polite attention. The play was clever. The dialogue was sharp. But he found his eyes returning again and again to the wings whenever the lights allowed him to see. There was movement there. Quick, nervous movement. An actress waiting for her entrance. A stagehand checking a prop. And once, very briefly, he thought he saw two figures standing close together, arguing in whispers. Then the lights changed, and they were gone. At the interval, Poirot did not go to the bar. He remained in his seat, thinking. Something in the atmosphere of the theatre felt wrong. It was not the play. It was the people making the play. He was still sitting there when George Lorimer appeared at the end of the row, looking pale. "Poirot," he said quietly, "could you come backstage for a moment? There's been a difficulty." Poirot rose at once. He followed Lorimer through the pass door and into the narrow, dimly lit corridor that ran behind the stage. The smell of paint and size was stronger here. Someone had dropped a cigarette end on the floor and not bothered to stamp it out. They reached the prompt corner. A small group of people stood clustered near the main curtain. The stage manager, a thin man with tired eyes, was speaking rapidly into a telephone. Two actors in costume stood a little apart, not looking at each other. Lorimer lowered his voice. "It's Eleanor Shaw. She was due on stage 5 minutes ago for the second act. Her dresser went to call her. She found her behind the curtain. She's dead, Poirot." Strangled. Poirot said nothing for a moment. He simply looked at the heavy folds of the crimson curtain, now pulled slightly aside. In the narrow space between the curtain and the back wall, a woman lay on her side. Her evening dress was dark blue. Around her neck was a thin piece of stage rope pulled tight. Her face was turned away, but the famous profile was still recognizable. One of her shoes had come off. It lay a little distance from her foot, as though she had kicked out in the last moment. "Who found her?" Poirot asked. "Her dresser, Miss Lane's girl, Peggy. She's in shock. I've sent her to the green room with a cup of tea." Poirot stepped closer, careful not to touch anything. He looked at the rope. It was ordinary hemp, the kind used for tying off scenery. It had been cut from a longer length. The cut end was still visible on a nearby cleat. "Has anyone moved her?" "No, only the dresser touched her, and then only to feel for a pulse." Poirot nodded. He looked around the small space. Footprints in the fine layer of dust on the floor. Several sets. One set was small, probably a woman's. Another was larger. There were also marks that looked as though something heavy had been dragged. He turned back to Lorimer. "The performance? We stopped it, of course. The audience has been told there is a technical difficulty. They are being kept in their seats for now. That is wise." Poirot's voice was quiet. "And the cast? Most of them are still in their dressing rooms. The ones who were on stage when it happened are in the green room. The police have been called." Poirot was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "George, you asked me here because you felt something was wrong. You were right. But I did not expect this." He looked once more at the body. "Tell me something. Who knew that Miss Shaw would be standing here, behind this curtain, at this particular time?" Lorimer hesitated. "Anyone who knows the play. In the second act there is a scene change. The curtain is brought forward for a moment while the set is struck. Eleanor had a quick change. She usually waited here, just behind the tab, so she could slip back on quickly when the scene was ready." "So it was known," Poirot said. "Known to the cast. Known to the stage crew." He turned away from the curtain. "Has anyone left the theater since the body was found?" "No, I gave orders at once. All doors are watched." Poirot gave a small, tired nod. "Then the person who did this is still inside these walls." He looked back towards the stage where the lights were still burning and the set of the bitter glass stood half-changed, as though the play itself had been interrupted mid-sentence. Somewhere in the building someone was breathing quickly. Someone whose hands had tied that rope. Someone who had hated Eleanor Shaw enough to kill her on the night she was meant to shine brightest. Poirot touched his moustache lightly, a small, unconscious gesture. "Come," he said to Lorimer. "Before the police arrive, I should like to speak with the dresser who found her. And then, I think, with the understudy." He began to walk towards the green room, his steps measured, his shoulders a little stooped. The tiredness he had felt earlier in the evening had not left him. If anything, it had settled deeper, but his eyes were sharp. Behind him, the crimson curtain hung still and heavy, as though it too were keeping its own secrets. Questions in the green room. The green room was a long, low-ceilinged space at the back of the stage. It smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cold tea. A single electric fire glowed in one corner, doing little to warm the room. When Poirot entered with George Lorimer, the conversation stopped at once. 3 people were there. A middle-aged woman in a black dress sat on the edge of a sofa, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. Her eyes were red. Next to her, a younger woman in a simple gray costume sat very straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had fair hair pinned back and a face that might have been pretty if it had not looked so pale and set. At the window, a tall man in evening dress stood with his back to the room, staring out at the dark courtyard. Lorimer spoke quietly. "This is Doris, Miss Shaw's dresser. She found her. And this is Miss Peggy Lane, the understudy. The gentleman is Mr. Julian Trent, who plays opposite Miss Shaw." Poirot gave a small, courteous bow. "Mesdames, monsieur, I am Hercule Poirot. Mr. Lorimer has asked for my assistance. I should like to ask a few questions while we wait for the police. It will not take long." He turned first to the dresser. "Madame Doris, you found Miss Shaw?" The woman nodded. Her voice was unsteady. "I went to call her for the second act. She always waited behind the main curtain during the scene change. It was quicker for her quick change. I called her name. She didn't answer. I pulled the curtain aside, and there she was. Did you touch anything? Only her wrist, to see if there was a pulse. There wasn't. Then I ran for help, Poirot nodded. And before that? Did you see anyone near the curtain? Doris hesitated. People were moving about. It was a scene change. Mr. Trent had just come off. Miss Lane was waiting in the wings for her own entrance later. Stage hands were shifting the furniture. I didn't notice anything strange. Poirot looked at her for a moment longer, then turned to the young woman on the sofa. Miss Lane, you are the understudy? Yes. Her voice was quiet but steady. How long have you been Miss Shaw's understudy? 6 weeks. Since rehearsals began. And before that, I was in the chorus of Carousel at this same theatre. When they needed an understudy for the lead, they asked me to read. Poirot's eyes were mild. You must have been pleased. Peggy Lane's mouth tightened slightly. I was. It's a good part. Eleanor, Miss Shaw, was very good in it, but I knew the lines. I could have played it. There was no boast in her tone. Only a flat statement of fact. Poirot noted it. Did you see Miss Shaw this evening before the performance? I saw her in the corridor when she arrived. She didn't speak to me. She never did unless she had to. Julian Trent turned from the window. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, with the easy grace of a leading actor, but his face was drawn. Eleanor could be difficult, he said. She didn't suffer fools, or understudies who got ideas above their station. Peggy's head came up sharply, but she said nothing. Poirot looked at Trent. You were on stage when the murder must have taken place, Mr. Trent? I came off after my last scene in the first act. I went to my dressing room to change. I was there when Doris started screaming. Can anyone confirm that? My dresser? He was helping me out of my coat. Poirot turned back to Peggy Lane. And you, mademoiselle? Where were you? I was in the prompt corner, waiting. I had a small part in the second act. I was going over my lines. Alone? Yes, mostly. She looked down at her hands. Mr. Harlan, the director, came past. He asked if I had seen Eleanor. I told him she was probably behind the curtain as usual. He went in that direction. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. Mr. Harlan was looking for Miss Shaw. He often did. They argued a lot. About the play, about her performance, about everything. Julian Trent gave a short, humorless laugh. That's putting it mildly. Poirot made a small note in a little book he had taken from his pocket. Tell me, Miss Lane, did you like Miss Shaw? The question was asked gently, but it hung in the air. Peggy Lane met his eyes. No, Mr. Poirot, I didn't like her. She was rude to me from the first day. She called me the chorus girl in front of everyone. She made sure I knew I was only there in case she got ill or broke a leg. But I didn't kill her. I wanted the part, yes, but not like this. Poirot studied her for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook. Thank you. That will do for now. He asked Lorimer to bring the director. While they waited, Poirot stepped into the corridor for a moment. He rubbed his eyes with thumb and forefinger. The tiredness he had felt earlier had returned, heavier now. It had been a long day even before the murder. He was not as young as he once was. These late nights, these sudden tragedies, they took more from him than they used to. Still, he straightened his shoulders and went back inside. Victor Harlan arrived a few minutes later. He was a lean, intense man in his late 40s, with sharp features and restless hands. He did not sit. He stood near the door, smoking a cigarette that had already burned down too far. Mr. Poirot, he said, Lorimer tells me you're looking into this. Good. The sooner we find out who did this, the sooner we can all go home. You were looking for Miss Shaw before she was found? Harlan nodded. She missed her cue in the first act by nearly 10 seconds. I wanted to know why. She was usually precise. And did you find her? No. I went towards the curtain, but the stagehands were in the way. By the time I got through, Doris was already screaming. Poirot watched the smoke from Harlan's cigarette. You and Miss Shaw argued often, I am told. Harlan gave a thin smile. We argued because she kept changing my lines. She thought she knew the character better than I did. She was wrong. but she had the power. The management listened to her. I did not enjoy being treated like an errand boy in my own production." His voice was calm, but there was bitterness underneath. Poirot asked a few more questions, then let him go. When the room was empty again except for Lorimer, Poirot sat down heavily on the arm of a chair. "Well, George," he said quietly, "what do you make of them?" Lorimer looked troubled. "Peggy wanted the part. Everyone knows that. Harlan hated the way Eleanor treated him. Julian, well, there were rumors he and Eleanor were more than colleagues at one time. It ended badly, I heard." Poirot nodded slowly. "Envy," he said. "It is a powerful motive. The understudy envies the star. The director envies the actress who has more power than he does. The leading man envies the woman who no longer wants him. All of them had reason to dislike Eleanor Shaw, and all of them had the opportunity tonight." He stood up. "But which one of them had the courage or the desperation to put a rope around her neck?" He looked towards the door that led back to the stage. "Somewhere in this theatre," he said, "there is a person who is breathing more easily now that Eleanor Shaw is dead. I intend to find out who it is." He paused and added in a lower voice, almost to himself, "I only hope my little gray cells are not too tired for the task." Lorimer looked at him with concern. "Are you all right, Poirot?" Poirot gave a small, weary smile. "I am never all right when there is a murder, my friend. But I am still here. That must be enough for now." He put his notebook away. "Come, let us see what the police have to say, and then, I think, we must speak with the rest of the cast. Someone among them knows more than they have told us." He walked out of the green room, his step measured but not quite as brisk as it had once been. Behind him, the electric fire popped and hissed in the empty room. Alibis in the wings. By the time Poirot and Lorimer returned to the stage, 2 uniformed constables had taken up positions at the past doors. A tall, thin man in a dark overcoat was standing near the body, notebook in hand. He looked up as they approached. "Mr. Lorimer," he said. "Inspector Graves. I understand you've asked Mr. Poirot to assist." Lorimer nodded. "Mr. Poirot has helped the police before. I thought it best." Graves turned to Poirot with a polite but guarded expression. "I've heard of you, sir. We'll be glad of any help, provided it doesn't interfere with proper procedure." Poirot gave a small bow. "I have no wish to interfere, Inspector, only to observe. The killer, you see, is still inside this theatre. That is a fact we cannot ignore." Graves glanced at the crimson curtain. "We've cordoned off the area. The pathologist is on his way. In the meantime, I'd like to speak with everyone who was backstage during the scene change." "That makes 2 of us," Poirot said quietly. They began with Bert Wilkes, the stage manager. He was a solid, gray-haired man in his 50s who looked as though he had spent most of his life in the shadows of one theatre or another. He stood with his arms folded, watching the police with weary resignation. "How long have you worked at the Lane, Mr. Wilkes?" Poirot asked. 27 years, sir. Started as a call boy. Worked my way up. You know the timings of this play well? Better than most. The scene change in question takes roughly 90 seconds. The main curtain comes forward, the tabs close, the furniture is struck, and the new set is brought on. Miss Shaw always waited in that exact spot during those 90 seconds. Everyone backstage knew it. Poirot studied him carefully. "Did you see her there tonight?" "I saw her go behind the curtain. That was about 40 seconds into the change. I was busy with the stagehands. Didn't see anyone else go near her after that. And after the body was found?" Wilkes rubbed his chin. "Chaos as you'd expect. I stopped the change immediately. Told everyone to stay where they were. Then Doris started screaming and it all went to hell." Poirot nodded. "One more thing, Mr. Wilkes. The rope that was used. Where does it usually live?" "On that cleat there," Wilkes pointed. "We keep short lengths for quick ties. Anyone backstage could have reached it in 2 seconds. Stagehands, actors, even the playwright if he was nosing about." Poirot made a note in his small book. "Thank you. You have been most helpful." Next they spoke to Simon Crow, the playwright. He was younger than Poirot had expected. Barely 30, with untidy hair and ink-stained fingers. He looked frightened and kept glancing towards the curtain. "I only arrived halfway through the first act," he told them. "I was in the bar having a drink. I came backstage when I heard the shouting. I never even saw Eleanor tonight." "You did not come to wish her luck before the performance?" Poirot asked mildly. Crow flushed. "She didn't want to see me. We'd had words yesterday. She wanted me to rewrite the last scene again. I refused. She said if I didn't do as she asked, she would speak to the management about replacing me with someone more cooperative." His voice shook slightly on the last word. Poirot watched him carefully. "You must have been angry." "I was angry, yes. But I didn't kill her. I need this play to succeed. Killing the leading lady on opening night is hardly the way to do it." After Crow left, Poirot and Inspector Graves examined the murder scene more closely. The rope had been pulled from behind, not from the front. There were no clear signs of a violent struggle on the floor, only a few footprints in the fine layer of dust. One set was small and narrow, almost certainly a woman's. Another was broader. A third set was smudged, as though someone had tried to rub it out with their shoe. Poirot crouched with difficulty, wincing slightly as his knees protested. He studied the marks for a long time, using a small torch that Graves had given him. "Interesting," he murmured. "What is it?" Graves asked. "These footprints. They were made after the murder, I believe. Someone came here, saw what had been done, and then tried to hide their own tracks. But they were not careful enough. Also, notice the position of the body. She was facing towards the stage, not the wall. She knew the person who approached her. She was not afraid until it was too late." He stood up slowly, brushing dust from his trousers. Graves made a note. Poirot turned to Lorimer, who had been waiting nearby. "George, I should like to speak with the rest of the cast individually, especially those who were not on stage during the scene change. And I want to know exactly where everyone was during those 90 seconds. Lorimer nodded. "I'll make a list." Poirot walked a little distance away and stood with his back against the brick wall. For a moment he closed his eyes. The tiredness was there again, pressing behind his temples. He had been on his feet for too long. The air backstage was thick and warm, and it made his head feel heavy. These late nights were becoming more difficult with each passing year. He opened his eyes and saw Peggy Lane standing at the end of the corridor watching him. When their eyes met, she turned quickly and disappeared towards the dressing rooms. Poirot frowned slightly. He was about to follow when Inspector Graves called him back. "Mr. Poirot, we've found something." Graves held up a small object in his gloved hand. It was a mother-of-pearl button, the kind found on expensive evening wear or costumes. It did not match Eleanor Shaw's dark blue dress. "Where was this?" Poirot asked. "Under the curtain, near her hand, as though it had been torn off during the struggle." Poirot took it carefully and turned it over in his fingers. "Someone was close enough for a button to come loose," he said. "Very close indeed." He looked back towards the empty corridor where Peggy Lane had stood a moment earlier. "Inspector," he said quietly, "I think we must speak with Miss Peggy Lane again. And this time we must be very precise about where she was standing during those 90 seconds when Eleanor Shaw was killed." He slipped the button into his pocket. The tiredness was still there, but something sharper had replaced it. The old familiar sense that a thread had been pulled, and now the whole pattern might begin to show. The weight of the little gray cells Peggy Lane was waiting in her small dressing room when Poirot and Inspector Graves arrived. The room was cramped, with costumes hanging on a rail and makeup scattered across a narrow table. Her gray first-act costume still hung there, one button missing from the front. She stood up quickly when they entered, her face pale but composed. "Miss Lane," Poirot began in his gentle but precise manner, "I must ask you again about the moments before Miss Shaw was found. You told us you were in the prompt corner." "Is that entirely correct?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I was there most of the time, but I moved a little closer to the curtain. I wanted to hear my cue more clearly. The acoustics can be strange from the prompt corner." Poirot reached into his pocket and took out the small mother-of-pearl button. He held it out on his open palm. This was found very near Miss Shaw's hand. It does not belong to her costume. Do you recognize it, mademoiselle? Peggy stared at the button. Her color drained slightly. It looks like one from my gray costume, she said quietly. I noticed a button was missing earlier this evening. I thought it had fallen off in my dressing room. Inspector Graves leaned forward. You were wearing that costume during the scene change? Yes, but I changed out of it quickly after my scene ended. I was in my ordinary clothes when Doris started screaming. Poirot's voice remained mild, but his eyes were sharp. When you went closer to the curtain, did you perhaps drop this button at that time? Or did you see anyone else near Miss Shaw? Peggy's hands tightened at her sides. I didn't go behind the curtain. I only stood near it. I swear it, Mr. Poirot. Poirot studied her face for a long moment, then nodded and put the button away. Thank you, Miss Lane. That will be all for now. Outside in the narrow corridor, Inspector Graves spoke in a low voice. She's lying about something. The button places her near the body. Perhaps, Poirot replied. Or perhaps someone wishes us to believe that. Lies are sometimes more revealing than the truth. He asked to speak with Julian Trent again. They found the leading man in his dressing room, still in his stage clothes, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He did not offer them seats. Mr. Trent, Poirot said, I have been told there was once a closer relationship between you and Miss Shaw. Is that true? Trent took a slow sip before answering. We were involved for nearly a year. It ended 6 months ago. She ended it, said she didn't need distractions while the play was being prepared. And how did you feel about that? Trent gave a short, humorless laugh. How do you think? I wasn't pleased. But I'm a professional. I can work with someone even if I no longer like them. Poirot tilted his head slightly. Did Miss Shaw perhaps threaten you in some way? Or did you feel she had damaged your position in the production? Trent's eyes narrowed. If you're asking whether I killed her, the answer is no. I was in my dressing room with my dresser when she'd confirm it. Poirot made a small note in his little book. When they left the dressing room, Poirot walked slowly towards the wings. He stopped near the crimson curtain and stood there for a while looking down at the marks on the dusty floor. Inspector Graves waited patiently beside him. After some time, Poirot spoke without turning around. I am getting old, Inspector. Graves looked surprised. Sir? Poirot gave a small, tired smile. Once, these little grey cells of mine worked faster. Now I look at this button, at these footprints, at the lies people tell so easily, and I feel the weight of them. I wonder if I am seeing clearly, or if fatigue is beginning to cloud my judgment. He rubbed his forehead lightly with 2 fingers. The long night was taking its toll. His eyes felt heavy, and there was a dull ache at the back of his head. He had been on his feet for too many hours, moving between dressing rooms and corridors, listening to half-truths and careful denials. Still, he straightened his shoulders. Miss Lane may be lying, he said quietly, or she may simply be frightened. Mr. Trent may be telling the truth, or he may be very skilled at appearing truthful. I do not yet know which. Graves was quiet for a moment. You still seem sharper than most men half your age, if you don't mind me saying. Poirot gave a soft chuckle. You are kind, Inspector, but kindness does not solve murders. Method does, and tonight method feels heavier than usual. He turned and began walking back towards the green room. As they passed the prompt corner, Poirot paused again. He looked at the small space where Peggy Lane had claimed to have stood. Something nagged at the edge of his mind, a small inconsistency in the timings. But when he tried to focus on it, the thought slipped away. He frowned, irritated with himself. Later, he murmured. I will see it later when my mind is clearer. They continued walking. Inside the green room, George Lorimer was waiting with a cup of tea that had already gone cold. Any progress? He asked quietly. Poirot sat down heavily on the arm of a chair. For a moment he allowed himself to look as tired as he felt. Progress, yes, he said. But clarity, that is still some distance away. We have suspects. We have motives. We have small pieces of evidence. But the picture is not yet complete." He looked towards the door that led back to the stage. "Somewhere in this theater," he continued, "there is a person who is breathing more easily now that Eleanor Shaw is dead. I intend to find out who it is. But tonight, these old eyes and these tired gray cells need rest." He stood up slowly. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "we will reconstruct those 90 seconds exactly as they happened." Sometimes the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. As they prepared to leave for the night, Poirot glanced once more towards the corridor where Peggy Lane's dressing room was located. He had the distinct feeling that she was still awake, sitting alone in the small room turning over the same questions in her mind. He understood that feeling well. With a final small nod to Lorimer and Inspector Graves, Poirot put on his coat and stepped out into the cool London night. The tiredness remained, but so did his determination. The case was not yet finished, and he would not rest properly until it was. Threads of envy. It was past midnight when Poirot asked George Lorimer to gather the remaining stagehands who had worked the scene change. They met in the large rehearsal room above the stage. The room was cold and smelled of old wood and dust sheets. 6 men stood in a loose group, caps in their hands, looking uncomfortable. Poirot questioned them one by one, his voice patient but precise. Most of their stories were the same. They had been moving furniture and flats during those 90 seconds. The space behind the main curtain had been blocked from their view for much of the time. One of the younger stagehands, a lad named Tommy, hesitated when Poirot asked if he had seen anyone near the curtain. "I saw Miss Lane," he said finally. "She was standing closer than she should have been. Right at the edge of the tabs. I thought she was just waiting for her cue, but she kept looking behind the curtain, like she was checking something." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Did she go behind it?" Tommy shook his head. "Not while I was watching, but I had to turn away to help with the flat. When I looked back, she was gone from that spot." Poirot thanked him and let the men go. When they were alone again, he turned to Lorimer. "The button belongs to her costume! And now we have a witness who saw her standing very close to the place where Eleanor Shaw died." Lorimer looked troubled. "Do you think she did it, Poirot?" "I do not yet know," Poirot replied. "But I know this. She has not told us the whole truth. And in a case like this, that is dangerous." They returned downstairs. Inspector Graves was waiting with news. "We've checked Julian Trent's alibi. His dresser confirms he was in the dressing room during the scene change. But the dresser also admits he stepped out for 2 minutes to fetch a clean shirt. Trent was alone for that time." Poirot absorbed this without comment. "And Mr. Harlan? His story checks out so far. Several people saw him near the prompt corner looking for Miss Shaw." Poirot nodded slowly. "So we have possibilities. The understudy who wanted the role, the leading man whose pride was wounded, the director who was made to feel small. All of them had motive. All of them had some opportunity." He paused, then added quietly, "Envy is a strange thing, George. It does not always drive people to murder. But when it has been fed for weeks or months, when it has been allowed to grow in the dark corners of dressing rooms and whispered conversations, it can become something else entirely." Lorimer looked at him. "You sound as though you've seen this before." "I have," Poirot said, "too many times. The theatre is a cruel place for those who feel they have been passed over. It feeds on ambition and disappointment in equal measure." He rubbed his eyes again. The tiredness had settled into his bones now. His head ached faintly, and he found himself wishing, just for a moment, that he could sit in a quiet room with a cup of tisane and think without interruption. But there was no time for that. "Inspector," he said to Graves, who had joined them, "I believe we must reconstruct those 90 seconds exactly. We need to see who could have moved where and when. Lies are easier to maintain in words than in movement." Graves agreed. "I'll arrange it for tomorrow morning when the cast is fresh, or as fresh as they can be after tonight." Poirot gave a small, tired smile. "Freshness is not required, only honesty." and that, I fear, will be harder to find." Before they left for the night, Poirot asked to see Peggy Lane's gray costume one more time. The missing button had been noticed by her dresser earlier in the evening. Peggy had been annoyed about it, but had not seemed particularly worried. Poirot held the costume up to the light. The place where the button had been torn was clear. The thread was broken, not cut. He put the costume down and stood for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular. Something still did not fit. The button placed Peggy near the scene. The stagehand had seen her close to the curtain, yet Poirot could not quite picture her as the killer. There was something missing, a piece of the pattern that refused to appear. He felt a sudden flash of irritation with himself. Once, he would have seen it already. Once, his mind would have turned the facts over and over until the answer revealed itself. Tonight, everything felt slower, heavier. He closed his eyes briefly. Patience, he told himself softly. Even the little gray cells must be allowed to grow tired sometimes. They will work again in the morning. When he opened his eyes, Inspector Graves was watching him with quiet concern. "Mr. Poirot, are you all right?" Poirot straightened his waistcoat. "I am as well as a man can be when there is a murderer still walking these corridors. Come, Inspector. Let us go home and rest. Tomorrow we will pull the threads tighter." As they walked towards the stage door, Poirot glanced back once at the great crimson curtain, now hanging still and dark. Somewhere in the theatre, someone was waiting for morning, too, and that someone, Poirot was certain, was not sleeping easily 90 seconds. The next morning, the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, felt strangely hollow. The usual pre-show energy was missing. Instead, there was a heavy, watchful silence that seemed to press down from the high ceiling. The great crimson curtain remained closed, and the stage lights had been switched on at full strength, exposing every crack in the old wooden floor and every speck of dust in the air. Inspector Graves had arranged everything exactly as Poirot had asked. All the key people were present on stage. Peggy Lane, Julian Trent, Victor Harlan, Bert Wilkes, Doris the Dresser, Simon Crowe, and 4 stagehands including young Tommy. They stood in their positions from the night of the murder, looking pale and uncomfortable under the bright lights. Poirot stood in the center of the stalls, one hand resting on the back of a seat. He looked older this morning. The lines around his eyes were deeper, and there was a slight stiffness in the way he moved. He had not slept well. The case had stayed with him through the night, turning over and over in his mind. "We will do this once," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the empty auditorium. "We will recreate the exact movements during those 90 seconds of the scene change. No one is to add anything or leave anything out. If something feels different from last night, you will say so immediately. Is that understood?" There were quiet nods and murmurs of agreement. Bert Wilkes gave the signal. The stagehands began moving. The heavy main curtain came forward with a soft, heavy sound. For a moment, the space behind it was hidden from view. Furniture was shifted. Flats were moved. The usual controlled chaos of a scene change filled the stage. Poirot watched everything carefully, his eyes moving from one person to another. "Miss Lane," he called out, "please show us exactly where you were standing." Peggy Lane walked slowly to the prompt corner. She stopped, then took 2 small steps forward. "Here," she said. Poirot turned to Tommy, the young stagehand. "Is this the same place you saw her last night?" Tommy shook his head firmly. "No, sir. She was much closer, almost right against the curtain. She stayed there for quite a while, looking towards the back." Peggy's face tightened. She took another reluctant step forward until she was almost touching the heavy fabric. "Like this?" she asked, her voice tight. Tommy nodded. "Yes, that's more like it." Poirot studied her for a moment, then looked back at the others. "Mr. Trent," he said, "show us your movements after you came off stage." Julian Trent walked to his dressing room door with his usual actor's grace. He opened it, stepped inside, then turned. "I went in. My dresser helped me remove my coat. Then he left to fetch a clean shirt from the wardrobe room." "How long was he gone?" Poirot asked. 2 minutes. perhaps 3. During that time, could you have left the room without anyone seeing you? Trent hesitated for half a second. Technically, yes, the corridor was empty, but I stayed inside. Poirot nodded, but did not look entirely convinced. He turned to Victor Harlan. Mr. Harlan, please show us where you were. Harlan moved to the prompt corner area. His movements were sharp and precise. I was here, he said. I was looking for Eleanor because she had missed her cue. I called her name once. When she didn't answer, I started moving towards the curtain. Did anyone see you go behind it? Poirot asked. Harlan shook his head. The stagehands were in the way. By the time I got through, Doris was already screaming. Poirot asked them to hold their positions. He walked slowly onto the stage himself and stepped behind the crimson curtain into the narrow space where Eleanor Shaw had died. The air felt cooler here. He stood very still, trying to picture those final moments. 90 seconds. In 90 seconds, someone had approached her, wrapped a rope around her neck, and killed her. Then they had tried to wipe away their footprints. He stepped back out into the light, moving more slowly than usual. His knees protested slightly as he straightened up. He ignored the discomfort and addressed the group again. During these 90 seconds, he said, someone moved from their position, committed murder, and returned. That person had to be quick, quiet, and familiar with this theater. He looked directly at Peggy Lane. Miss Lane, when you stood so close to the curtain, did you hear anything? Any sound of struggle? Any voices? Peggy hesitated. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. I heard something, she admitted quietly. I heard voices, low voices. One was Eleanor's. She sounded angry. Then, nothing. Just the noise of the stagehands. Why did you not tell us this before? Poirot asked gently. Peggy looked down. I was scared. I didn't want to get involved. I thought if I stayed quiet, maybe it would all go away. Poirot studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He turned back to the group. His voice was calm but carried a new weight. Someone here is not telling the complete truth. Not about everything, only about one small but important thing. And that small thing will eventually reveal the rest. He paused and rubbed his temple with 2 fingers. The bright stage lights were beginning to bother his eyes. He felt the familiar dull ache starting behind them. For a brief moment, he wished he could sit down in a quiet corner and close his eyes, but he pushed the feeling aside and continued. Mr. Trent, he said, your dresser was gone for 2 or 3 minutes. That is more than enough time for someone to step out, do what needed to be done, and return. Your relationship with Miss Shaw had ended badly. Your pride was hurt. That is a dangerous... Julian Trent's face had gone hard, but he said nothing. Poirot looked at Victor Harlan again. And you, Mr. Harlan? You were constantly at odds with Miss Shaw. She changed your lines. She questioned your authority. She was preparing to have you removed from the production after opening night. That kind of professional humiliation, repeated over weeks, can turn into something much darker. Harlan's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression under control. Poirot took a slow breath. The tiredness was pressing on him more heavily now. He could feel it in his shoulders and behind his eyes. Once, these cases had excited him now. They left him drained. Still, he straightened his back and looked at each of them once more. We will not leave this theater today, he said quietly, until the person who put that rope around Eleanor Shaw's neck is revealed. He let the silence stretch. Because one of you, he continued, his voice low but clear, is still hiding behind the crimson curtain, and I intend to find out who it is. Final curtain. The following afternoon, the stage of the Theatre Royal felt heavier than usual. The crimson curtain remained drawn. The set of the bitter glass stood frozen in place, as though the play itself had been interrupted and never allowed to continue. Inspector Graves stood quietly to one side with 2 constables. George Lorimer sat in the front row of the stalls, his hands clasped tightly. The remaining cast and crew, Peggy Lane, Julian Trent, Doris, Bert Wilkes, and Simon Crowe, stood in a loose semicircle on the stage. Poirot stood in the center. He looked tired, deeply tired. The events of the past 2 days had left their mark on him. His shoulders were slightly stooped, and there was a weariness in his eyes that even his usual neat appearance could not hide. He began to speak in his calm, precise voice. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "we are here to finish what was started on opening night. Eleanor Shaw was killed behind that curtain during a 90-second scene change. The killer did not come from outside. The killer was already here, working, smiling, and moving among you." He turned slowly to face Peggy Lane. "Miss Lane, you were seen standing very close to the curtain. The button from your costume was found near the body. For some time, suspicion naturally fell upon you. You wanted Miss Shaw's role. You had been treated with contempt by her. But you did not kill her." Peggy's eyes were red, but she lifted her chin slightly. "You were there." Poirot continued gently. "You heard voices." Eleanor's voice raised in anger. "You were frightened. That is why you lied about your exact position. Fear, not guilt, made you hide the truth. You are not the murderer." He moved his gaze to Julian Trent. "Mr. Trent, your relationship with Miss Shaw had ended badly. Your pride was wounded. You had a window of 2 or 3 minutes when your dresser was absent. It would have been possible for you to leave your room. But murder of this kind, sudden, messy, and done in the shadows, is not in your nature. You care too much about appearances. A man like you does not risk his reputation on such an impulsive act." Trent gave a short, bitter nod but said nothing. Poirot then turned to Victor Harlan. His voice became quieter but no less clear. "And so we come to you, Mr. Harlan." The director stood very still. His face was pale, but his eyes were hard. "You argued with Miss Shaw constantly. She changed your lines without permission. She questioned your direction in front of the cast. Most importantly, she had decided to have you removed from the production after opening night. She told you this herself. For a man who has spent his life in the theater, being pushed aside by an actress you considered difficult and arrogant was more than professional disappointment. It became personal humiliation." Harlan's mouth tightened, but he remained silent. Poirot continued, "On the night of the murder, you went looking for her because she had missed her cue. You found her behind the curtain. You spoke to her. She dismissed you, perhaps for the final time. In that moment, years of resentment, envy, and wounded pride rose up. You picked up the piece of rope that was hanging nearby. You acted without thinking clearly. And then, in a clumsy attempt to protect yourself, you took the button you had earlier torn from Miss Lane's costume and placed it near the body, hoping to direct suspicion towards the understudy who so obviously envied Miss Shaw." A heavy silence filled the theater. Harlan finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "She was going to destroy me," he said. "After everything I had done for this production, she was going to have me thrown out like I was nothing. I couldn't let her do that." Poirot looked at him with something close to sadness. "Envy," he said softly, "is a quiet poison. It begins with small resentments. A changed line here, a public criticism there. Over weeks and months it grows. It twists a person's thinking until they believe they are justified in doing terrible things. You did not set out to become a murderer, Mr. Harlan, but envy made the act feel necessary to you." Inspector Graves stepped forward and placed a hand on Harlan's shoulder. This time the director did not resist. He stood for a moment looking at the stage around him, then gave a short, tired laugh. "I suppose it's over now," he said quietly. As the police led him away, the others remained on the stage, stunned and silent. Poirot turned to face them once more. He looked older than he had at the beginning of this case. The tiredness that had been growing in him over the past 2 days was now clearly visible. "Envy," he said again, addressing everyone. "It is the most destructive force in this world of make-believe. Actors envy other actors. Directors envy the power of stars. Understudies envy the ones who stand in the spotlight. It hides behind polite smiles and backstage compliments. And sometimes, when it is fed long enough, it destroys lives." He paused, glancing towards the heavy crimson curtain. Miss Shaw was not a perfect woman. She was difficult, proud, and sometimes cruel. But she did not deserve to die in the shadows of the very stage she loved. No one does. He looked at Peggy Lane. Miss Lane, the part is now yours. I hope you will play it with more kindness than the woman who came before you." Peggy nodded silently, tears in her eyes. Poirot picked up his hat and coat from a nearby chair. He moved slowly, as though his body was protesting the long hours of standing and thinking. George Lorimer approached him. "Poirot, I don't know how to thank you." Poirot gave him a small, weary smile. "There is no need, my friend. I came here to watch a play and found a tragedy instead. Such is life." He glanced once more around the empty stage. "These old gray cells of mine," he said quietly, almost to himself, "they still work, but they move more slowly now. And the weight of these cases, it stays longer than it used to." He placed his hat on his head and adjusted it carefully. "Now, if you will excuse me, I believe I shall return to my hotel and rest. A man of my age should not spend too many nights in theaters where murder has been committed." As he walked towards the stage door, Poirot paused for a final moment beneath the great crimson curtain. He reached out and touched the heavy fabric with one gloved hand. It felt cool now, the warmth of the stage lights long gone. He let his hand fall and stepped out into the pale afternoon light of Drury Lane. Behind him, the curtain hung still and silent, waiting for the next time it would rise, and for whatever secrets it might one day hide again.